Hello, and welcome to this lecture for the Chrysalis Diploma in Counselling Skills and Theory. This is for Component 2, Foundations of Counselling and Theory, Part 2, the Humanistic Approach. This is Module 2. You can find the standards met by this particular component outlined in Moodle and in your written course materials. I will today share some slides with you throughout this lecture, and you will be able to view and download these slides from Moodle as well, if you wish. Please note any questions you might have as you're watching this lecture, and take these questions to class to discuss with your class tutor. So, key aspects of the humanistic approach. So, humanistic philosophy, so we're not talking about therapy here, we're talking about philosophy, informs therapy approaches such as person-centered therapy, an important theory and practice for us to focus on this year. So humanistic philosophy proposes the following principles. So let's go through these in a little bit of detail because they are important. So the first principle, existentialism, essentially is saying that a person is a free agent who can map his own development. Now, this is quite different to some of the approaches that were around at the time that the humanistic approach was generally forming. So, for example, Freud's approach doesn't consider that we have free conscious will. It considers that, that we are driven by unconscious processes, and sometimes we don't actually consciously know why we're doing something or why we've done something. We just know that we have done it, and we may try to rationalize it afterwards. So behaviorism also, doesn't look at us as individuals having free will, but the humanistic approach does. And says we can take our own pathway, we can map our own development. We are a free agent, or at least we are at the start of our lives. Okay, so phenomenology, a very important aspect of the humanistic approach here. The individual's subjective experience is all important. Now let's think about that for a moment. Because what that is actually saying is that there are many, many different ways of doing the right thing. That actually, sometimes if we consider that somebody's behavior or attitude seem to be quite strange, then perhaps we don't really understand the formation of that behavior or those attitudes, what it's based on, what experience it's based on, how they are perceiving the world. So this is particularly important in therapy because we have to work with the individual's subjective experience. We have to try to step into their shoes and see the world through their eyes. So we have to develop empathy, which we'll look at in more detail in a little while. It's the individual's subjective experience that is all important. And actually, what this means in affecting therapy is that the individual will know best what they need. Now, that can be quite a difficult thing to grasp when we think about the concept of helping, because helping to many of us means, I know what to do. I know what I did in that situation. I've got some good advice for you here. Well, what people generally find to be helpful is this. That doesn't necessarily mean that what your client is going to find helpful are any of those things. So it's something that we really have to think about. This idea that two people in the room may be working towards helping the client to meet their goals. And the person who knows best how to meet those goals is not us, the trained therapist, but actually the client, because they know themselves better than anybody else does. And they know how they see things, and they know how they perceive themselves and the world around them. Okay, the next principle, self-actualization, an individual's drive to reach their full potential. So this is a key part of the humanistic approach as well. This idea of self-growth, and this idea of this innate drive that we have within us, like many other living creatures around us, like a plant, for example, where give the plant the right environment, and the plant will grow towards its maximum capacity. It will, it will grow strong and tall and grow leaves and flowers possibly and fruit. And it will do all of that. There is some drive there to make that happen. And this philosophy says that we are the same. We have a drive to self-actualize, to be the best person that we can be, to be the best person who we are that we can be. This is not us comparing ourselves to others. This is not trying to be better than others or to be competitive or anything like that, really. It's about us recognizing our potential, and it's about us reaching our potential. And in order to reach our full potential, this approach says that we need the right environment. So just like the plant needs good soil and water and sunlight, we need the right environment. And Carl Rogers' person-centered approach is based on these key principles. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide, shall we? So Rogers' person-centered counselling, you will also see this called client-led counselling, okay, or client-centered counselling. It all means the same thing. So note that if you come across those different terms, either at Chrysalis or in your textbooks, that they are all referring to the same thing. So broadly, Rogers' approach doesn't have a lot of theory to it. It doesn't have a very strong model of the mind in the way that some other approaches might do. But it does have a set of principles which is important to understand. So what Rogers says is that essentially when we are born as a young child, we are who we are. We are our true self. We are just who we are, and we do things that feel right for us. So we know what makes us happy, and we do that, and we know what makes us feel good, and we ask for that, and so on and so on. But as we begin to grow, and as we begin to understand, and as our parents and carers and those around us are teaching us, we begin to receive judgments from others. Judgments from others telling us how to behave, telling us what is socially acceptable, what is polite, what is friendly, what is good and what is bad. So we begin to become more socialized and more sociable. Quite similar, this concept, to Freud's concept of the superego, if you like. So, where we have that kind of set of societal rules that start to develop for us. Now, of course, what's happening here for the young child might not necessarily be always what they want to really do. So, there might be some times where there is some conflict there between what they really like to be doing in terms of their behaviour and what they are told is good behaviour or what they're being told they shouldn't do. So sometimes it fits quite naturally with us, and that's okay. So sometimes when people guide us in our behaviour, we do actually want to do those things, and we do feel better for it. So we develop conditions of worth. Okay, conditions of worth are a set of internal rules that we must comply with. Now, some of those we will be quite happy to comply with because they make sense. Like if I am nice to that little boy next door, then he will play with me, and that's good, and that feels good, and I like that, so I will be nice to him. But others may be sort of rules that are imposed on us, which feel more challenging to us, but we start to get them. We start to understand that they are necessary, and we start to understand that we have to do them. So we force ourselves to accept these rules. And then what starts to happen is that we then only begin to accept ourselves if we are meeting those standards. So even though I may feel like just running and shouting and screaming and laughing down the street as a young child, I know that actually what I need to do is I need to walk quietly and calmly, holding mummy's hand and not pull forward or anything. And then I am meeting that standard. And I am then meeting a standard of an ideal self. So the issue then, says Rogers, is that this ideal self can end up being very different to our real true self. And when this occurs, then incongruence happens, incongruence within ourselves. There is a conflict between what we would really like to do or who we really are and what we are telling ourselves we must do. Rogers is a great believer in being able to sort of step back and look at those times where we're telling ourselves that we have to do something, or we must do something, or we should do something. And he speaks about how that feels very different to the idea of, I want to do it, or I will do it, or I love that, or I like doing this. There's a real difference there, isn't there? And the greater the difference between our real self and our ideal self, the greater our emotional distress. Now, what makes this difference? Well, there can be many different things, but essentially we could say that this is very often down to environment. So the child who is given free expression and knows that they have those times in the day where they can just run around and laugh and giggle and so on, and do silly things, perhaps their ideal self is closer to their real self because they feel that it's okay for them to express themselves. People around them are allowing them to do that. Not necessarily all the time, but then the set of rules regarding times when it's appropriate and times when it's not appropriate might feel okay. Just like in our education system, for example, there are periods of time throughout the young child's day where they are shown and taught and expected to sit quietly in the classroom and to work quietly and to do what our teacher is telling us to do. And then there are break times where children run and shout and scream and laugh and, and burn up that energy and do actually what they want to do at that time. So some children who are growing up in a household where there are lots of imposed rules as to how children should be, may perhaps feel more in a conflict than children who are growing up in a household where they are given a fair amount of freedom to actually do the things that they enjoy and to have that time. Okay. So let's mention the core conditions, something that you have probably come across before because I believe that we look at this briefly in year one. But the core conditions are connected to creating the right environment. Remember when we looked just a moment ago at the humanistic approach and the philosophy behind it, then one of the key aspects there is being able to have the right environment. Now, what Rogers is talking about here is he's not talking about, having a nice room to sit in or having a very comfortable therapy room. All of those things help, okay? But we're talking about the right therapeutic environment, the right environment for the emotional life of the client. So the right therapeutic environment allows the client to connect with their true self by connecting with their feelings. And for Rogers, this is a key to successful therapy. Now, by feelings, what we mean are feelings of sadness, joy, anger, frustration, happiness, despondency, all kinds of emotions along possibly with bodily sensations. It's like, oh, I felt a shiver down my back when I heard about that, or oh, I feel all tingly now, or so some bodily sensations there as well. So because for Rogers and for many others, successful therapy is about helping people to connect with our feelings, because our feelings are messages to ourselves of what our true values are and what is truly important for us. So the young child may feel frustrated every time they are told to sit down and be quiet. So that feeling of frustration helps them to understand that they would really like to be doing something different. So many of us can, as adults, have a feeling of frustration or a feeling of anger, for example, or a feeling of anxiety in lots of different situations. And then that can be an indication that we are not living the life that feels truly like ours. Now, we know, of course, that, in one sense, we might say, well, is it realistic to actually be able to live a life that, we truly want to live? So, many of us would, feel that we have had to adapt and so on. But Rogers is talking about being true to ourselves. Being true to ourselves and to think, well, actually, yes, I know that I have led myself along a particular career path because I can do it and it brought me the income that I needed, and so I get on with the people okay, and it gives me what I need at the end of the month, and it's regular and it's kind of easy to do. And there's nothing there that might indicate that it's part of our true values. When somebody, however, is saying, oh, I love my job, it is the best ever, I get such a reward from it personally, and yes, sure, I know that, sometimes it could be paid better, but, I get so much benefit from it, then there is a difference there. And the difference there is how somebody feels. How somebody feels. So connecting with our feelings is particularly important. So, and Rogers as well recognises, going back again to the humanistic approach, that clients, indeed we as individuals, have the capacity to self-heal, to be self-directive, and that we need to give them the opportunity to do so. So we are not directive in the person-centred approach. We follow the direction of the client where they want to go. We step alongside them and we support where they want to go. But we are not directing. We are not telling them that they need to be doing this or they should be doing this, because then all we are doing is creating more conditions of worth for them. Oh, my therapist said that I should do this and then I will be better. That's not what this approach is about. So this approach takes the core conditions. There are actually 6 in total, as you can see from your notes, but the 3 main ones that relate to what we are trying to do as therapists and promote within our therapeutic approach are these 3 here. So, unconditional positive regard. So, valuing and prizing and respecting the client, respecting their individual experience, respecting their feelings, trying as much as we can to understand that they are doing the best job that they can do in the circumstances in which they have been living their life. So unconditional positive regard, valuing the client, seeing the client as the individual that they are and working with their positive resources. So not thinking that the client is in a worse position than us in some way, that we are somehow superior to them because they've got a problem and we haven't. That is so generally not true at all. You will meet the most wonderful clients throughout your career who truly inspire you. And we also have to recognize that perhaps unlike other people, perhaps unlike ourselves, our client is somebody who takes some action, who seeks some help, who changes something when they feel the need to. And that's something that we should really value and prize as well. So unconditional positive regard. The next one, empathy, incredibly important in Roger's work. So empathy, trying to understand the subjective experience of the individual, trying to understand how the client is experiencing their world. So, a straightforward example of this might be if a client tells us about their particular specific phobia. Perhaps they have a phobia of something quite specific. Let's say a phobia of dogs. Perhaps we are a real dog lover. Or perhaps we don't really feel either way about dogs. They're okay, they're nice, but we can take them or leave them. So, but our client is absolutely terrified of dogs. So we have to understand that fear in order to work with them. We have to understand that if we hear ourselves suggesting, and I hope not in this approach, we hear ourselves suggesting, well, what you need to do is to just spend time in the park, just sit down on a park bench and just, notice how friendly those dogs are. So perhaps we are not there truly understanding just what a terrifying thought that might be for our client who has their fear of dogs. And we need to understand more about where that fear has been coming from and what's created and promoted and maintained that fear. So empathy is often described as trying to step into the client's shoes and walk around in those shoes. And we work very hard at this, and it means that we are tentative in our explorations with the client. And if we are unsure as how they are approaching something or what they are thinking about something or how they're feeling about something, then why don't we ask them? So the third core condition, congruence. Now this goes back to just what we were talking about a little while ago. Remember clients' incongruence? So clients in a conflict between who they feel they truly are or what they truly want and what they feel they need to be or should be or have to do. The conflict between the two. So we as therapists attempt to promote congruence within ourselves. So we need to be congruent. We need to understand ourselves. We need to be comfortable with ourselves. We can't help a client to become more congruent if we are working very hard on our shoulds and musts and have-tos. So in this sense, we need to understand right at the beginning of our training here that essentially we are learning to be the therapist who we will be. We are not learning to be just like Freud or just like Rogers. We are not learning to do things just like Rogers. We are not trying to emulate a therapist that we might watch on YouTube who is clearly excellent at what they do. So as soon as we start trying to emulate somebody else or try to really work at something, then there's a possibility that we are not being true to ourselves. We have to feel this. We have to feel our way forward. We have to recognize what's working for us. So we have to promote our own experience of congruence. And that means that, a big aspect of training to be a therapist is also learning about ourselves. It's applying what we are learning about human nature to ourselves. It's asking ourselves, well, what do I truly want? What do I truly value? What's really meaningful to me? What am I telling myself I should do or I must do? And why am I doing that? And how does that make me feel? So much self-reflection is really important in this work. Okay, so I hope we're following so far. Okay, so in our work with the client, we've already established here some very important principles. So how are we then assisting a client if they know better than we do? If they know how to grow towards who they need to be better than we do? If they need to lead in their own understanding and gain their own insights and so on better than we do? What is it that we're actually doing in therapy then? And this can be the first of our real challenges, okay? The first of our real challenges in therapy is recognizing that we are not necessarily the expert in the room, and we don't know the client better than they know themselves. And therefore, therapy is not about giving advice. Because if it were about giving advice, then how would we know what advice to give to somebody when everybody's experience of the world is different? How do I know that my advice will work for somebody else? And how are they going to feel about knowing that my advice is not going to work? And if I just continue to give them advice, well, you just need to do this, and then you should do this, and this will really help. If I continue to do that, then I'm going against the core principles of Roger's approach, which is that the client knows best. And if they are just trying very hard to seek advice from everywhere, to seek advice from experts, to see us as the expert from whom they want advice, then all they are doing is creating and strengthening those existing conditions of worth. So what we need to do is we need to give the platform to the client and assist their thinking and assist their feelings. So we are providing them with the environment in which to grow. And then we are promoting their growth. And we do this by assisting them to consider what is best for them. So this is called growing an internal locus of control. So an internal locus of control, it's like, yes, I am sitting at the center of myself and I am driving, I'm in the driving seat of myself. So I'm considering what works best for me, as opposed to having an external locus of control where I am feeling quite possibly bombarded by all kinds of advice around me, including now the advice from my counsellor. So no, we don't give advice, and no, we don't direct the client as to what they have to do. Instead, we help them to explore their feelings through reflecting and paraphrasing, summarising short aspects of a session as well. So in these techniques, which I hope you will have had some practice at already, then what we are doing is we are helping the client to hear more of what it is that they are saying. So we are helping them to hear their story. So we are reflecting back in a very similar way what they have just said. We're not trying to move their story along. We're supporting their story. We are summarizing their story for them. We are speaking back to them that which they have already expressed. So the client may be talking about, what was happening for them and how frustrating that was and so on. And what we are doing then at appropriate times is just reflecting that back to them so that they are hearing even more about how frustrating that experience was for them. And by doing this as well, we help the client to keep their awareness in the present. So this is a key aspect of the humanistic approach as well. It's like, well, it's what we are feeling now that is important. So we can actually ask the client, how are you feeling as you speak about this? What feelings does this generate for you as you're speaking about this? Could I just ask you, how was that for you? So this is called immediacy, where we are helping the client to stay in the present moment and explore how they are feeling, because very often as people, as clients, we have a tendency to rush ahead and to ignore our feelings. And we can find ourselves in a position where we are not really in touch with our feelings. And Roger says that very often that is the case when we're experiencing difficulties. It's very often the case at the starting point of therapy. So, but we also need to be working with this sense of immediacy. We need to be present with the client. We need to not be letting our mind drift. So we cannot be distracted, for example, by our own recent events. When we are with a client in session, we must be completely focused on that session, completely focused on what is happening in the present moment. So not distracted by what happened this morning, nor distracted by noise or phones or disturbances. Of course, sometimes those are unavoidable, but we can cut those down as much as possible. We mustn't be too tired or uncomfortable to actually be able to engage with the client. And importantly, we mustn't be making up our mind about the person. So we mustn't be diagnosing them and then only listening to that which confirms our beliefs about them. So we mustn't be making those quick judgments. Okay. So our approach is non-judgmental. We remain open and we remain listening in an active way. And we mustn't be distracting ourselves by trying to create a perfect reflective response to the client so that we miss other things that they're saying. This takes practice, and practice helps a lot. And practice is going to allow you to really get these skills. But be kind to yourself, okay? Be kind to yourself and let these skills build gradually, because this may all be very new to you. So a second aspect that we just need to remind ourselves is that actually, well, okay, if we're not giving advice and if we're not telling the client what to do, then we'll be asking a lot of questions so that we can form the right way forward. Yes? And the answer is no. The answer is no. We don't ask a lot of questions in therapy. Now, of course, there are some questions that we will need to ask, okay? But what we don't do is we do not turn the session into a question and answer session. And it's very easy for that to happen. And so I'm asking you now that when you are doing your practice with your volunteers, with your peers rather, then do try very hard to avoid the use of questions unless it really feels completely appropriate. Because questions are directive. Questions can stifle what the client was just about to say. Questions can take the course of what the client was thinking about completely in another direction. And then the client can feel a growing sense of frustration that actually they are not able to express themselves. So we try to avoid that question and answer trap. A session is not an interview. Now, of course, we need to recognize that right at the starting point of a therapeutic relationship with a client, there may well be some questions that we may need to ask. So we may need to go through a consultation and assessment with them. We may need to ask them the very basics. And of course, we do need to ask those basics, like, for example, full name, address, contact details, have you received therapy before, and so on and so on. But we don't want this to be a basis of what our therapy sessions are going to become. In counselling, most questions are unnecessary. And if we don't check our tendency to ask a lot of questions, then the client will start to offer nothing in those sessions apart from giving answers to those questions. And that can feel incredibly stifling and incredibly unhelpful. So why might we find ourselves asking a lot of questions? Well, very often we ask a lot of questions simply because we feel anxious if there's silence. Now, silence is something that we have to consider is important in therapy. I wonder if anybody can remember being in a situation where somebody posed a question to you or gave you an idea, and you started to think about that, and you started to think about how you felt about that, And then before you had a chance to really formulate how you thought about that, the other person had jumped in with another question or another thought. And then what you were thinking about just disappeared from your mind. You weren't being silent because you had nothing to say, and you weren't embarrassed by that silence. You weren't just sitting with a blank mind. You were working something out. You were considering something. And while you were considering it, you were quiet. And as a therapist, we need to recognize that that is very often what the client is doing, especially if they are reflecting on something which is challenging for them, or something that has been a concern for them for a long time, or something that they've never really thought about before, or that they're now thinking about in a completely different way. They might need some time to actually consider that. They might need some time to bring a memory into their mind. They might need some time to really focus on how they do feel about something. They might need time to actually connect with the emotion that they can relate to in that particular situation. So if we feel anxious because there is silence, then perhaps that's something that we just need to do a little bit of rehearsal on. We don't have to jump in and fill that silence. It's okay for it to be there. So if we ask a lot of questions, it might be that we forget that the therapy is about the client understanding themselves. So, again, it's like, well, this is for the client to work out. We don't need to give them the answers because they have the answers. Asking a lot of questions is very often a habit that we form due to our current or our previous profession. So many of us may come to training in counselling with a current or previous profession where we are the expert, where it is our job to elicit a lot of information from the client or person who we are working with in order to give a direction, to give a decision, to come up with the right advice. So a lawyer, for example, may have to ask a lot of questions to a client in order to give the legal advice that they're then going to give. So somebody in citizens advice, for example, might need to have a lot of information from the client so that they can direct them towards the right help. And this can then be a challenge for us because it's harder to break a habit we've already formed than if we have never had that habit in the first place. But even if we aren't in a different kind of helping profession, it is very often the case that a lot of us find that we can be the go-to person that people come to us for advice on all kinds of things. And we have to remind ourselves here that we are assisting the client to give themselves advice. So if we are asking questions, it might be something like, how do you feel about that? Or what do you think you could do? Or what do you think? Or if you were advising yourself there, what might you say to yourself? We can feel anxiety when we're asking a lot of questions because we're thinking in the back of our mind that it's our job to fix the client, that we have to be doing something here. We have to be giving value for money. The client is going to walk away and think, well, they didn't do anything. That's rarely the case if we use this approach in the right way. It's not our job to fix the client. It is our job to assist the client to help themselves. So we may be forgetting that the client knows what they need better than we do. Now, the client may not believe that to start with because the client may be used to always being told what to do and always being asked, always asking other people what to do. And so this can be quite uncomfortable for clients at the beginning of therapy where they realize that we're giving them space, where we are interested to hear about their ideas, about their feelings, about what they feel might work for them. And we are interested to hear that in a non-judgmental environment, so that when the client does say, well, I feel that what would work for me is this, then we are not tutting or looking alarmed or sitting back in our chair and folding our arms, or just saying bluntly, really, do you really think that's going to work? You know, that's what we're not doing. We're giving the client space to grow. So, for all these kinds of reasons, certain questions, why questions, leading questions, multiple questions, and pushing questions are all to be avoided. Why questions, why did you do that, can seem like such an innocent question, but there is so often a sense of judgment behind that. The client interprets that as, I definitely did the wrong thing there. Why did you do that? We can almost hear it there, can't we? Leading questions. Okay, so you know, trying to lead the client in a certain direction. So when you decided that you didn't like that person, what did you do? It's like, well, had they actually decided they didn't like that person, or are we leading them in a direction here that we have decided for them? Multiple questions are confusing for anybody, you know, let alone in a therapy session. So what did you do? Did you do this, or did you do that? Or did you feel that you should have done that? Which one is the client supposed to answer there? And pushing questions. So pushing questions very often when we have already decided what it is that the client needs and we just want to get there. We just want to get there. So we're just kind of pushing them forward. Open questions, on the other hand, can be helpful in moderation, and some closed questions will be also needed for clarification. So open questions are, you know, those questions like, well, how did you feel? As opposed to, you felt sad then, didn't you? Yeah, so you know, very often open questions are those which cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. So there is a possibility there for the client to really reflect. Okay, so some thoughts there. So Roger's process of self-actualization. Okay. Process of self-actualization. So this is a possible process that the client may move through in therapy. Now, that's not to say that all therapeutic goals should be towards self-actualization, because that would be an error on our part. That would be a judgment on our part. But Rogers feels that there are 7 stages for the client to become the person who they can be, the person who they are. And this starts off with a minimal sense of self-awareness, where somebody is not in touch with their feelings and perhaps blames others for things that have gone wrong in their lives. And the next step up from that is that the client experiences some less rigidity. There might be small movement towards taking responsibility. Now, what we're not talking about here, we're not talking about, oh, well, yes, sure, you know, what happened there is clearly my fault. But behind this is an understanding that the more responsible we can feel for our lives and how we do things, then the more in control of our lives we are, and the more we are living the life we want to live. So taking responsibility for that we can take responsibility for feels like a good thing. Now, these 2 first points may not be the point where a client comes to therapy. It may be more that they may be starting at point 3, for example, where the client is beginning to consider their responsibility, but tends to generalize and puts more emphasis on their past than on their present feelings. So they're not really connecting with how they're experiencing the world presently. So, but as we begin now to work with the client, to give them space, to allow them to connect with their feelings and to assist them to be present, then they become more in touch with their present feelings. As they become more in touch with their present feelings, they may tend to be self-critical at this stage, says Rogers. And then it's only at stage 5 where the client's feeling more connected with their current feelings and able to experience and express them more, where that self-criticism starts to diminish as we start to value as a client our own experience and our own reasons for doing the things we do. At stage 6, the client's having a realization perhaps of previously being stuck and is feeling more empathy towards both themselves and others. So able to see the other's point of view, but also importantly, able to see their own point of view and able to give empathy towards themselves and to understand why they've done the things that they've done or why they felt the way that they felt. And then the 7th stage, the client's conditions of worth are being replaced by those internally generated values, so that the client is becoming a fluid, self-accepting person, open to the changes that life presents. And this process, towards self-actualization. So self-actualization has also been looked at by another humanistic theorist called Maslow. And Abraham Maslow created something called the hierarchy of needs, and it's very often represented in this kind of pyramid. So again, Maslow talks about this self-growth and this fulfillment of our personal potential. And he says that it's important when we are recognizing where we are able to put our energy on this self-growth journey, that we recognize that we have different layers of needs. So not just those emotional needs, but also layers of physiological safety needs, for example, and our attention will be towards those needs which are most urgent. So our energy is being directed towards those needs that are most urgent. So this is interesting because this goes back to our recognition of the humanistic approach that we need the right environment to essentially be able to comfortably grow towards the fulfillment of our personal potential. So if we have our physiological, our safety needs sorted out, as we aim to do in modern society for most of us, for example, then we find it easier to focus on those esteem needs, those fulfillment needs more easily. If we are struggling with needing to find food, security, being safe in our surroundings and so on, it's going to be very difficult, very challenging to work on our self-actualization, to work on our sense of respect for ourselves and our status. So this has become quite apparent recently, of course, as we have been adjusting to very recent situations with COVID-19 and so on, that for many of us, we had to go right back to just reaffirming those safety and physiological needs. So we had to go right back. Perhaps we had to just put our studies to one side for a moment. So maybe we were, all ready to read those chapters relating to Rogers on our reading list. And then we recognize that actually our priority at this moment is ensuring that we can get food from the supermarket. So, and it's ensuring that we are safe and that we feel safe from any threat that may be around us. And this has been, in that sense, a very interesting time for us in recognizing what Maslow is talking about here. So in terms of working with our clients, then the environment that we are hoping to provide for our clients needs to be one, first of all, where their basic needs are met. So, just in terms of, the client should not sit in our session thirsty or cold. So, if the client says, listen, I have to pick up my child, straight after this session, then, we have a responsibility to make sure that that session is not overrunning so that they are now feeling anxious their energy is going to what they need to do next. So we create the right environment as much as we can, and we're creating the right emotional environment for the client as well. So we are assisting the promotion of, first of all, a good relationship with us and a sense of belonging in that therapy where we are engaged with the therapeutic process. It's clear that we are actually wanting to be present with this client. And we are giving recognition, we are giving unconditional positive regard and empathy and respect towards our client. We are helping them to be the person who they are so that they can then move up to being in that position. So lots to think about there, and just asking you to consider this and to reflect upon this and to remind yourself that this takes a little while. It takes a little while to get this, okay? And you've got plenty of time. We'll have plenty of practice on this throughout the remainder of this year and the following year as well. And of course, so in the humanistic approach, we are all growing, we are all reaching our potential, and we're all doing this perhaps all of the time. So we don't necessarily ever have to feel that there's a stopping point, that we've got there, if you like. Okay, but in terms of creating the right environment for the therapist, let's just look at some practicalities here to bring, as we bring this session closer towards a close today. So, what do our clients need to know? Well, in terms of them feeling comfortable and them not having their anxiety increased by us not giving them basic information, then we need to remind ourselves, and again, put ourselves in clients' shoes and think, well, what if I were a client, what would I need to know in order to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to feel that I could engage with this process? Well, first of all, I want to feel comfortable that my basic and any special needs that I might have are going to be met. I don't want to have to ask my therapist if I can have a drink of water or if I could have an extra cushion because the chair is terribly uncomfortable for me. I want to know that my therapist is keeping what I say confidential. I want to know if there are limits to that confidentiality and why they might exist and how I would know about those. So my client, as the therapist now, my client needs to have the space in order to explain their reasons for seeking therapy, and that they can have that space to consider their hopes and their goals for therapy, so that my client can use this space. As the client, I need to know what the payment and cancellation policy is. I need to know, am I expected to pay for these sessions? If so, how much? Can I afford this? How long is this going to go on for? What happens if I can't make a session? Will I still get charged for it? I need to know how long this session is going on for. Is it half an hour? Is it an hour? How long? I need to know. I need to know at least some guidelines of number of sessions. Do I just come to counselling for once? Or do I come for the next year? Or how many sessions is this going to be? When can I expect to see change? I want to know a little bit about my therapist. So who they are, what are their qualifications? Are they insured? Do they have registration of some kind? I want to know why you might be taking some notes and what you do with those notes and who else sees those notes. And I want to know that I can air any concerns and that if I don't understand something, I can ask you about it and that you will tell me. So I also, as the client, need to understand the boundaries. I need to understand that professional warmth is not the same as friendship. I need to understand that my therapist is a professional and that my therapist is not going to become a friend. Even if we get on really well, I need to understand that my therapist has skills of building rapport. and that my therapist can best assist me by having that professional boundaried relationship with me. So boundaries are very important. So I need to know that you, the therapist, are going to keep my identifying data private. I need to know how you're going to use that data. By my identifying data, I mean my name, address, my contact details, perhaps some sensitive data in respect of my religion or social status. So I need to know about confidentiality. I need to know that you are going to keep the sessions confidential. And what we discuss is confidential, and I need to know what those exceptions are. This is a very important point. I need to have a clear understanding of the times and frequency of sessions, and a clear understanding of if or when I can contact you between sessions, and what I might be able to contact you about, and what for and when. These are things that you have to agree. I need to understand that you would probably not take me on as a client if we had a dual relationship, if I were, for example, already a friend of yours or a family member. And I need to understand as well that if there were a conflict of interest, you are not likely to take me on as a client. So, for example, if we already had an existing relationship, so a supervisory relationship or a tutor relationship or a relationship with work colleagues, then there would be a dual relationship or a conflict of interest that's created there. Now, very often what we do as therapists is we put all these points together into a contract. And it's something that hopefully you've already looked at last year. We recommend at this time that you do actually have a straightforward and simple written contract because it can be easy to forget points, and it can be easy to forget what you have verbally agreed or what you verbally need to go through. And these points need to be sort of set out and agreed and possibly negotiated in a straightforward way. They need to be reflected on as well. So this is something that perhaps you can reflect on in your practice groups and with your colleagues too. So, why might it be important for the client to know that you keep things confidential? Why might it be important to have limited contact between sessions? Why is it important that you don't, as a professional therapist, give therapy to your close friends or family members? All of these things can be considered, and all of these things reflected on, so that you are already starting to be able to conduct really comfortable, really helpful sessions with the people who you're practicing with. So thank you very much for listening. We are just bringing this to a close now. So this has been Module 2, the humanistic approach, and I hope that you found it helpful and beneficial, and I look forward to working with you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.